What if I told you that the image of Jesus you've likely seen all your life, the white-skinned, blue-eyed, brown-haired portrayal, is far from what Jesus of Nazareth probably looked like? What if I told you that this image, which adorns cathedrals, homes, paintings, movies, and popular culture, is not just inaccurate but potentially misleading, shaping how we understand one of the most influential figures in human history? In this video, we will dive deep into the true identity of Jesus, using biblical references, historical context, archaeological findings, and scholarly research to unveil a clearer image of what Jesus really looked like. We'll also explore how and why the white image of Jesus became so prevalent, especially in Western society. Before we get started, welcome to our channel. We're thrilled to have you join us on this incredible journey of discovery and spiritual reflection. If you enjoy content that digs deeper into historical truths and biblical insights, then this is the place for you. Please make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss out on the enriching stories and discussions we bring to you. With that said, let's dive right in. The image of Jesus as a fair-skinned man with European features didn't emerge accidentally. It was crafted over centuries, influenced by cultural, political, and theological forces. From the early days of Christianity, artists and believers depicted Jesus in ways that reflected their own environments. One of the most iconic depictions comes from the Renaissance period, when European artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci shaped the image of Christ for generations. Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel portrays Jesus as a strong, muscular figure with pale skin and flowing brown hair. Similarly, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper features a gentle-looking, light-skinned Jesus surrounded by his disciples. These images became the standard in Europe not because they were historically accurate, but because they aligned with European ideals of beauty and divinity at the time. During the Renaissance, European artists sought to represent Christ through the lens of their own cultural values, reflecting what was considered divine or virtuous in their society. At that time, beauty was often associated with pale skin and European features, so naturally, Jesus was portrayed that way. However, these artistic choices inadvertently shaped how millions of people around the world would come to imagine Jesus. As European empires expanded through colonization, they spread not only their culture and religion, but also their images of Christ. Missionaries carried the gospel to Africa, the Americas, and Asia, but along with their teachings about Jesus, they introduced a specific European image of him, the white Jesus. In colonized societies, this image became deeply embedded in the religious consciousness of millions of people. In many cases, the image of a white Jesus was used to reinforce European superiority. It was a visual representation that symbolized not just Christianity, but also European power and dominance. Colonizers used this image to justify their systems of oppression, hierarchy, and control. The image of a white Christ carried divine validation for colonial rule, implying that European colonizers were closer to God. This had particularly damaging effects in contexts like slavery, where enslaved Africans were taught Christianity by their white masters. The image of a white savior was often used as a tool to suggest that salvation was linked to submission to white authority. Interestingly, the Bible provides very little detail about Jesus' physical appearance. None of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, offer a direct description of what Jesus looked like. For someone who has played such a pivotal role in history, this omission is quite surprising. So, what can we infer from the Bible? A frequently cited passage comes from Revelation 1:14-15, which offers a symbolic description of the risen Christ. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace. Some interpret the mention of feet like brass as an indication that Jesus may have had darker skin, given that brass has a brownish hue. When brass is heated in a furnace, it turns even darker, possibly suggesting that Jesus' skin tone could have been brown or dark. Another passage often referenced is Isaiah 53:2, a prophecy about the coming Messiah. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. This suggests that Jesus may have been an ordinary-looking man by the standards of his time, not someone with particularly striking physical features. However, this doesn't tell us much about his ethnicity or skin color. To get a clearer picture of Jesus' appearance, we need to consider the historical and geographical context in which he lived. Jesus was a Jewish man born in the region of the Middle East, specifically in 1st century Palestine, modern-day Israel. At that time, the average Jewish male likely had olive to dark skin, dark eyes, and dark curly hair, features common among people of the region. In fact, recent forensic and archaeological research supports this view. A team of scientists and scholars, led by British forensic anthropologist Richard Neve, used skulls from the region and period where Jesus lived to create a model of what he might have looked like. The resulting image is quite different from the traditional European portrayal. Jesus would likely have had darker skin, a broad nose, short dark hair, and a stocky build, not the tall, fair-skinned figure we often see in Western art. The widespread acceptance of a white Jesus can largely be attributed to European colonialism and missionary activity. As European powers spread their influence across the globe, they not only brought Christianity, but also their cultural depictions of Christ. As a result, many parts of the world adopted both the religion and the European image of Jesus. This portrayal has had lasting consequences. In many places, the image of a white Jesus became intertwined with notions of power and divinity, reinforcing social hierarchies that placed white Europeans at the top. This is particularly evident in the history of slavery and racial oppression in the Americas, where the image of a white Christ was used to suggest that Africans and other non-Europeans were inferior and needed the guidance of their white Christian masters to achieve salvation. It's important to remember that Jesus was not European. He was a Middle Eastern Jew who lived in a specific time and place, with a physical appearance that reflected the people of that region. While the image of a white Jesus may have been a product of cultural forces in Europe, it is crucial for us today to seek a more accurate and inclusive understanding of Christ. By exploring the historical, biblical, and archaeological evidence, we can begin to rediscover the true identity of Jesus, a man whose message of love, justice, and redemption transcends race and ethnicity. Let's explore the geographic and ethnic context of Jesus to better understand his likely physical appearance and how it differed from the widely accepted European depiction. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, grew up in Nazareth, and spent most of his life in what is now Israel and Palestine. Historically, this region is part of the Levant, a crucial cultural crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe. For centuries, it has been a melting pot of different peoples and ethnicities, influenced by trade, migration, and conquest. The Levant has always been at the heart of major historical developments, with empires such as Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome vying for control over this strategically important area. By the 1st century, the region was under Roman rule, and the population was incredibly diverse. The inhabitants of Palestine at that time would have ranged in skin tone. Though the majority were likely brown or olive-skinned, much like people living in the Middle East today, the Jewish people to whom Jesus belonged are classified as Semitic. The term Semitic encompasses many ancient peoples, including the Jews, Arabs, and other groups in the region. These populations typically had darker skin, though, as in any region, there was variation. Jesus, born into this Semitic population, would have shared many physical traits with the people of the area. During Jesus' lifetime, Palestine was under Roman control, and the Roman Empire was vast and multicultural, stretching across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Soldiers, traders, and travelers from across the empire passed through the region, bringing a mix of ethnicities and cultures. This cosmopolitan environment further contributed to the region's diversity. For example, trade routes connected Palestine with Africa, Asia, and Europe. People from as far as Egypt, Greece, Persia, and Arabia regularly interacted in this region. The diversity within the empire meant that individuals of different ethnic backgrounds were a common sight. While the dominant Jewish population likely had Middle Eastern features, Jesus would have encountered people from a range of ethnicities during his life. One key biblical event that suggests Jesus and his family were not drastically different from the local population is their flight to Egypt. In the Gospel of Matthew 13-15, we learn that Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus fled to Egypt to escape King Herod's massacre of young boys in Bethlehem. Egypt, located in North Africa, was a natural place for them to seek refuge, and it's significant that they could blend in with the local population. Egyptians historically and during this period would have had darker skin, especially compared to Europeans. This implies that if Jesus and his family were able to live among the Egyptians without drawing attention, they likely shared some physical similarities with the local North African population. This is a strong indication that Jesus may have had a darker complexion than the European versions of him often seen today. Africa plays a significant role throughout the Bible, often serving as a place of refuge or importance. From the very beginning, the Bible establishes Africa's relevance. In Genesis, the Garden of Eden is described as being near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But other rivers, like the Pishon, are said to flow through the land of Kusha region, associated with Africa, particularly Ethiopia. This early reference indicates a geographical connection between the biblical narrative and Africa. Egypt specifically is mentioned throughout the Bible, including in the stories of Joseph, Moses, and of course Jesus' flight. Africa's presence continues in various forms. For example, in the story of Moses, Egypt serves as both a place of refuge and oppression. The Israelites lived in Egypt for centuries before their exodus, and Egypt remains a pivotal part of their identity. Other African nations are mentioned throughout the Bible as well. In the book of Jeremiah 13:23, there is a reference to the Ethiopians stating, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard his spots?" This rhetorical question suggests that Ethiopians were recognized as having darker skin, which was a notable physical feature. The presence of African people in the biblical narrative further emphasizes the geographic and ethnic diversity that shaped the world of the Bible. One of the most compelling references to Africans in the New Testament is the story of Simon of Cyrene, who helped Jesus carry the cross on the way to his crucifixion. Cyrene was a city in North Africa, in what is now Libya, and Simon, hailing from this region, was likely dark-skinned. Although the Bible does not explicitly describe his appearance, his geographic origin strongly suggests that Simon was of African descent. Another prominent African figure in the New Testament is the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in Acts 8:26-40. Philip, one of Jesus' disciples, encounters this man, a high-ranking official in the Ethiopian queen's court, and explains the gospel to him. The Ethiopian eunuch is among the earliest non-Jewish converts to Christianity, symbolizing the spread of the Christian message beyond Jewish communities and into Africa. These African figures demonstrate the interconnectedness of the ancient world and challenge assumptions about the ethnicity of key biblical characters. The Bible's narrative includes Africans playing important roles, and this interaction between African populations and early Christians suggests that people of African descent were present and active in the early Christian story. For centuries, Western Christian traditions primarily portrayed Jesus through a European lens. This began to change as biblical scholarship, anthropology, and archaeology advanced, leading to new perspectives on Jesus' physical appearance. Scholars today largely agree that Jesus would have looked like a typical first-century Jewish man, which means he likely had dark olive skin, dark hair, and Middle Eastern features. Dr. Reza Aslan, a scholar of religion and author of Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, argues that Jesus would have resembled the average person living in first-century Palestine. This means that his skin would have been darker, likely olive-toned, and he would have had Middle Eastern features, quite different from the fair-skinned, blue-eyed images often seen in Western art. In 2001, forensic anthropologists used data from archaeological findings to create a digital reconstruction of what a typical Jewish man from Jesus' time might have looked like. The resulting image showed a man with dark olive skin, a broad face, dark eyes, and short curly hair. While this reconstruction does not claim to be an exact likeness of Jesus, it provides a more accurate representation based on the available historical and archaeological evidence. The idea that Jesus may have had African ancestry or strong connections to Africa is an intriguing theory supported by historical, cultural, and theological perspectives. Scholars advocating for this viewpoint highlight the interconnected nature of the ancient world, particularly the Afro-Asiatic region, which included parts of Africa and the Near East. Trade routes, migration, and cultural exchange between these regions were common, and the movement of people between Africa and ancient Israel was significant. Therefore, the suggestion that Jesus or his ancestors could have had African roots is not far-fetched, given the historical context. One perspective that underscores this possibility comes from Afrocentric scholarship, which emphasizes the African cultural and historical contributions to various civilizations, including early Christianity. Afrocentric scholars argue that Jesus, based on his geographical and historical context, was more likely to have had dark skin or even African ancestry. This view stands in contrast to the traditional Western portrayal of Jesus as a white man with European features, a portrayal that has been dominant in Christian art for centuries. The argument for Jesus having darker skin is also supported by the fact that ancient Israel was part of a broader Afro-Asiatic world, where trade, travel, and cultural exchange between Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean were commonplace. Ancient Israel was located at a critical crossroads of this interconnected world, and its people would have been influenced by both African and Asiatic cultures. Additionally, the Jewish population itself was part of the larger Semitic group, which included other populations like the Arabs, many of whom were darker-skinned. Moreover, the flight of Jesus and his family to Egypt, as described in the Gospel of Matthew, reinforces the connection between Jesus and Africa. According to the story, Mary, Joseph, and the infant Jesus fled to Egypt to escape King Herod's massacre of young boys in Bethlehem. Egypt, being in North Africa, was a natural refuge for the Holy Family. The fact that they sought refuge in a country with a predominantly African population suggests that they likely did not look dramatically different from the local people, further supporting the notion of Jesus having darker skin. The influence of Africa on early Christianity is also evident in the spread of the faith across the continent. Early Christian communities were remarkably diverse, spanning regions from the Levant to Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some of the earliest Christian art, especially in places like Ethiopia and Nubia, modern-day Sudan, depicted Jesus with darker skin. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, has long portrayed Jesus as having dark skin in its religious art. In these depictions, Jesus is often shown as a black man surrounded by other figures with similarly dark complexions. The fact that Ethiopian Christianity, which dates back to the 4th century, consistently depicted Jesus as black is significant. Ethiopia's early conversion to Christianity, coupled with its historical isolation from European influence, suggests that these depictions of Jesus were not influenced by Western ideals of beauty or race. Instead, they reflected the cultural and ethnic context of African Christians, who saw Jesus as one of their own. North Africa also played a vital role in the development of early Christian thought. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the most important centers of Christian theology and philosophy during the early centuries of the faith. Many prominent theologians, such as Augustine of Hippo, who was born in what is now Algeria, were Africans. Augustine, one of the most influential figures in Christian history, shaped much of Christian doctrine. His African heritage points to the fact that early African Christians would have viewed Jesus through a lens that reflected their own experiences and identities. These depictions and understandings of Jesus as a figure with African connections challenge the idea that the image of a white European Jesus has always been dominant. Early Christians in Africa and possibly in other parts of the world likely had a more diverse understanding of Jesus' physical appearance. In fact, the whitewashing of Jesus' image became more prominent as Christianity spread to Europe, where Western ideals of beauty began to shape religious art. In the context of African American religious traditions, particularly during and after the period of slavery, the notion of a black Jesus took on profound significance. For many enslaved Africans and their descendants, Jesus, who endured suffering and death at the hands of an unjust empire, became a powerful symbol of hope and liberation. The idea that Jesus could have been black strengthened this connection, offering a sense of pride and identity to those who had been told they were less than human. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the image of a black Jesus gained more prominence, especially within African and African American communities. The civil rights movement in the United States, along with the rise of liberation theology in Latin America and Africa, brought renewed attention to the idea of a black Jesus. Theologians like James Cone, often considered the father of black liberation theology, argued that Jesus must be understood as being on the side of the oppressed. For Cone and others, the traditional depiction of a white Jesus was incompatible with the message of the gospel, which calls for justice and liberation for the marginalized. Cone's work emphasized that Jesus, as a liberator, should be seen as identifying with black people and the struggles they face. In this context, the image of a black Jesus became a symbol of empowerment and resistance against oppression for black Christians, particularly in the United States and Africa. The Black Christ took on profound significance, not only as a way of reclaiming history, but also as a means of reclaiming dignity, identity, and a sense of belonging in a world that had used religion as a tool of control and marginalization. As more black theologians, artists, and activists embraced the image of a black Christ, this idea began to spread globally. In African American churches, the notion of a black Jesus offered a powerful counter-narrative to centuries of racism and exclusion. For many, the Black Christ became a symbol of divine solidarity with the oppressed, offering not just spiritual salvation but also a message of social and political liberation. In conclusion, the idea of Jesus having African ancestry, or at least significant connections to Africa, is supported by historical, cultural, and theological evidence. The interconnected nature of the Afro-Asiatic world, the diversity of early Christian communities, and the African origins of many early Christian theologians all point to the possibility that Jesus may have had African roots. This perspective challenges traditional Western depictions of Jesus and offers a more inclusive and diverse understanding of his identity, one that resonates with people across different cultures and backgrounds.